What's up, everybody? It's AJ. We're back with another reaction. Hit play.
1995, 16 years before his death, Steve Jobs sat down for an interview that would become known as the Lost Interview. Steve Jobs laid out a theory, specifically warning about exactly how great technology companies rot from the inside. But if you look at the company Steve Jobs actually left behind, the comparison is difficult to ignore. In that 1995 interview, Steve Jobs described a pattern he'd watched happen at Xerox, a company that had, in his words, invented nearly every piece of technology that defined modern computing and then somehow failed to build a single successful product out of any of it. He asked why, and the answer he arrived at wasn't about talent, because Xerox had brilliant engineers. The answer, he said, was about who ends up running a company once it becomes dominant. His theory went like this. When a company is small and fighting for survival, the people who matter most are the ones who can build something better than what exists. But once a company achieves a monopoly, or something close to one, a strange thing happens. Because making your product 10% better doesn't meaningfully move your sales anymore, because customers are already locked in with nowhere else to go. And when that happens, the people whose skills actually drive growth are no longer the engineers and designers. They are now the people who can manage pricing and the brand itself.
Yeah, because, well, at the beginning, it's about changing people's lives and making something better. And after it gets to a certain point, it's just about continuing to be a money printing machine. So if you're constantly trying to make things better to make people's lives better, when you make a small adjustment to it, the last product that you made already made my life so much better that I don't need to worry about buying the next version until it's time for me to buy another version. Um, and when you need to put one out every year to make money and to continue to be profitable, it becomes really hard.
The biggest example of this is Pepsi. Steve Jobs pointed out that a genuinely new product came along perhaps once a decade, and even then, what counted as new was usually just a different sized bottle. And this is because in a business like Pepsi, sales and marketing executives matter more for the ability to sell an existing product rather than the people who design the drink. Jobs argued that the same disease could infect a technology company once it achieved a comparable level of dominance, and that once it did, the people would have no real feel for what separated a good product from a bad one. And he had lived through this exact cycle already when he was forced out of Apple in 1985 by the same executive he'd personally recruited to help run the company. And this poses the question of if he handed his own company to exactly the kind of executive he warned people about.
Yeah, it becomes passion versus profit almost. Like Steve was in it for the passion, in it for the innovation. Yeah, he probably wanted to make money because it is a company. He has things that he needs to support, family and people that he needs to support. But it was about the innovation and not just about the bottom dollar.
Tim Cook joined Apple in 1998 as a senior vice president of worldwide operations, brought in specifically to fix a supply chain that was, at the time, one of the company's biggest liabilities. Before Apple, Cook had spent 12 years at IBM, followed by stints at Intelligent Electronics and Compaq, companies centered on operations and logistics rather than product invention. His entire professional identity was built around logistics and squeezing efficiency out of global supply networks. He slashed Apple's inventory turnover and built the manufacturing relationships in China that let Apple produce hundreds of millions of devices a year. But that skill set is precisely the one Steve Jobs' theory identifies as dangerous once it takes over the top job. A man named Walter Isaacson, who had spent years interviewing Jobs for his authorized biography, later revealed that Jobs' private assessment of Cook was more pointed than what made it into the published book. In one exchange, Isaacson recalled, Jobs ran through everything Cook could do, and then delivered the verdict directly that Tim's not a product person. But he deliberately handed Tim Cook the keys, because in 2011, Apple needed someone who could take the products Jobs and Ive had already imagined and scale them into a global empire, manufacturing hundreds of millions of units a year without the operation collapse.
So maybe I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't his passion versus his ability to make money, because passion versus profit, because he handed over the company to the profit guy. So what does that say?
And he repeated publicly ever since, never ask what Steve would do, just do the right thing. Because he had watched Disney's leadership paralyze itself for years after Walt Disney died, endlessly asking what Walt would have wanted, and he refused to let that happen to Apple. But 8 years into Cook's tenure, the theory got its clearest test case, and it had nothing to do with a marketing decision or a pricing tier. But the pattern had actually started much earlier, within Cook's first full year in charge. In October 2012, Apple fired Scott Forstall, the executive who had run iOS software since its creation and one of Steve Jobs' closest protégés inside the company. The trigger was Apple Maps, which had launched that September to a public disaster, sending drivers down runways and stranding people in the Australian outback. But by most accounts, the Apple Maps failure wasn't what actually got Forstall fired. What got him fired was his refusal to sign the public apology Cook wanted to issue, insisting the criticism was overblown, in the same way Steve Jobs had once shrugged off complaints about the iPhone 4's antenna. Tim Cook signed the apology himself and pushed Forstall out within weeks. 7 years later, the same pattern played out with Apple's most important remaining product voice. In June 2019, Ive announced he was leaving Apple to start his own independent design firm. And Apple's public statement was warm and gave no hint of tension.
So now, all of the people who were originally a part of the idea, the conception, or the building up of making it where you could make it a global brand, they're gone. All of their ideas are still there, though.
But reporting from the Wall Street Journal, based on people close to the situation, painted a different picture. Ive had grown distant from the company for years, and the specific complaint attributed to him was that Cook showed little real interest in the product development process itself. Ive had reportedly clashed with other Apple leaders over how to position the Apple Watch, pushing to market it as a fashion object rather than an iPhone accessory, and he lost that argument. Tim Cook publicly called the reporting absurd. But the person who had been Jobs' closest creative partner for 2 decades, the man behind the iMac, the iPod, and the iPhone, walked out during Cook's tenure, 7 years after Forstall.
That's pretty big, too, because those are revolutionary products. I mean, there's a lot of people who have touched those products. Even if we just take out the iPhone and we're talking about the iPod and the Mac, there's a lot of people who have touched those products and it has changed their lives.
The explanation reporters kept landing on was the same one: a leadership team that drifted from product toward operations. 2 of the last people in the building who thought the way Jobs thought left within a decade of each other.
In the Jobs era, there was one iPhone a year, occasionally with a budget variant. A single, focused product that represented Apple's complete statement about what a phone should be. Under Cook, the lineup expanded into a genuine grid, with a standard, Plus, Pro, and Pro Max, and for a period a Mini alongside a budget SE as well. This era contained multiple screen sizes, multiple price points, multiple tiers distinguished largely by camera count and chip generation, rather than fundamentally different ideas about what the device could do. And this is the exact thing Steve Jobs talked about with the different sized models. And the tactics used to differentiate those tiers often had little to do with product philosophy and more to do with margins. They did this by extracting more value from the customers. Because Apple removed the charging brick and headphones from the box starting with the iPhone 12, officially framed as an environmental decision, while the retail price of the phone stayed exactly where it was. Storage upgrades, moving from the base tier to double the capacity, have for years been priced at a premium that vastly exceeds the actual cost of the additional memory chips,
turning a component that cost Apple a few dollars into a $100 upsell. The removal of the headphone jack in 2016 pushed millions of customers toward buying separate dongles or Apple's own wireless earbuds, converting what had been a built-in free feature into an accessory purchase. While Tim Cook's Apple was becoming what Steve Jobs didn't want, Tim Cook was also funding the M-series chips, arguably the most significant engineering achievement of his tenure, taking the Mac from a machine that had fallen behind the industry and turning it into some of the best consumer computing hardware available anywhere. The Apple Watch and AirPods also followed the same pattern, each building a category that barely existed before Apple built it. And the watch in particular succeeded despite Ives losing the internal argument over how to position it. So where does the 1995 theory land? Partly true, partly not, and the true part is uncomfortable precisely because Jobs chose it himself. He wasn't overthrown the way he was in 1985. He handed the company over willingly to a man he knew wasn't a product person, betting that Apple's next chapter needed exactly that skill set to survive. Whether that adds up to a betrayal of everything Jobs stood for, or simply what any company run competently at this scale for 14 years eventually becomes. Jobs told Cook not to spend his tenure asking what Steve would have done. So maybe the fairer test isn't whether Cook built the company Jobs would have built, it's whether he did the right thing on his own terms. But those two questions don't have to have the same answer.
Yeah, I think about the ability that we have as people right now to think on our own thoughts and go our own way. And I know that that's a very small population of the people. Now people are so caught up in doing what other people think is right for them instead of doing what's right for them. So I understand how Steve might have seen the world going this direction and said, I'm going to make sure my legacy goes on. I do think one tough thing with starting a business or having an idea is the idea that you come up with is your idea and you're the one that cares the most about it because it's your idea. You could try your best to convey that idea to other people, but you can't make someone else care about something that you came up with yourself. So you got to work really hard to make sure that you find people that align with you in the same way, and that will continue your business or whatever your idea is along in the way that you would have wanted them to, which I guess he did because he told him to don't worry about what I would have done, what I would do, just do what you see fit, and he picked him. So now there's a lot of people stuck in this Apple ecosystem. If you enjoyed this video, if you thought it was interesting, leave a comment, leave a like, and send this video to your cousin.